This is a big can of worms, and there's lots of diverse opinions about this. Probably the worst thing you could do is pull it out of the site, drive it down to the university, and then ask the archaeologist, "Hey, how old is this thing?" But really, the ways we are different are not biological; they're entirely cultural.
So the pro is with him.
Indeed.
Hello and welcome to AnthroTalk, the podcast about all things anthropology and humanity. My name is Jake Selesky and I'm your host. I'm joined today by Jelmer Eerkens, Dr. E. Jelmer Eerkens is an archaeologist currently teaching at the University of California, Davis. To summarize his profile on the Davis website, he studies how humans adapt to social and environmental conditions and how these adaptations affect our practices and tools. He, quote, applies evolutionary models to better understand changes in the archaeological record, and he uses a variety of archaeometric applications, including stable isotope analysis, proteomics, gas chromatography, electron microprobe, neuron activation, and X-ray fluorescence. I only know what half of these are, but hopefully by the end of this episode, we'll all know a little bit more about archaeology. Also, he's a former professor of mine, a streak now. He's the fourth former professor in a row on my podcast.
Hey.
And Dr. E, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So first, I think the most important thing to do is kind of define what an archaeologist is. Because I feel like archaeology is one of those fields where you ask someone, what does an archaeologist do? And you probably get answers ranging from, they study dinosaurs, right? Or they get treasure from caves, right? Or they dig up human bones, or they study pottery or something. So from an archaeologist, what is an archaeologist?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I get that oftentimes when I'm at a party or somewhere and I say, I'm an archaeologist. People oftentimes ask me if I've seen Jurassic Park or something about paleontology, and then I have to tell them, no, that's paleontology. I'm an archaeologist. So basically, archaeologists are interested in humans, only humans. We're interested in human behavior, how humans have evolved. Of course, we are interested. So and by contrast, I'll say, so paleontology is the study of animals. Archaeology and paleontology are oftentimes confused with one another. But a paleontologist is really more interested in animals and animal behavior, the evolution of animals, either biologically or their behavioral patterns. And archaeologists are interested in humans and the evolution of humans and human behavior. Of course, the world is not black and white, and there are definitely overlap there. Humans, we've domesticated lots of animals, we cohabitate with animals, but generally, if we have, let's say, bones of animals, if humans are responsible for depositing those bones, whether it's through hunting or just they were co-living with humans, then that's generally falls within the realm of archaeology. Whereas if it's animals that die of quote unquote natural causes, that would be more paleontology. But again, as I said, the world's not black and white. There's shades of gray, and there's definitely kind of overlap between archaeology and paleontology. But generally, that's what we do.
So it sounds like if it's like related to humans in the past, it's more archaeology. And if it's not, like there's some bird fossil somewhere, then it's not archaeology.
Correct. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So then I name dropped a bunch of different methods of dating in the description. I think 6 or so. And I'm curious to learn more about what the tools and methods of archaeologists are and how the people who date things. Let's just take an example of say that an archaeologist found a clay pot in the desert. How does someone just see a clay pot and it's like, oh, this is exactly how old this is? It seems like almost like magic to do something like that. So how would that work?
Yeah, so one of the key things in archaeology and also in paleontology, but we want to know how old things are. That without knowing how old something is, we can't really study evolution and change and try to understand how and why human societies are so different today than they were long ago. We need to be able to date things. So a big area in archaeology is coming up with different techniques to date things. Generally, there's two kinds of dating techniques that we can categorize them into two different kinds. So one is what archaeologists call relative dating techniques. This is just where we say something is younger or older than something else. It gives us a relative sequence. We don't know how much older than another thing, but we can say that it's older. And so a good example of a relative dating technique is stratigraphy. And within it, so you can imagine, let's say people are living somewhere, and they've got houses, and occasionally maybe there's an earthquake or a fire and things collapse down, and then they rebuild on top of where they were. They toss out their garbage. And so over time, you get sort of layers built up in an archaeological site. Eventually, maybe the site's abandoned, and some archaeologists come in and say, hey, we want to study the people that were living here. And so we can dig down through the site, and you can imagine then the things that are at the bottom should be the oldest, and the things that are at the top should be the youngest. We don't know how much older or younger they are. People could be living on top of an old Paleolithic site, or they could be living on top of a medieval town. But we just know that the deeper down you go, it's older. So that's called a relative dating technique, stratigraphy. Another relative dating technique is called seriation. And people might be kind of inherently familiar with this if you think about different cars and car styles. If you think of like a Model T from the early 1900s, it has a particular style to it, a particular shape, versus, like a car from the 1970s, like a old station wagon, or like a Chevy Impala or something from the 1970s versus a car today. Let's say like a Tesla or a Cybertruck or one of those kinds of cars. But you can look at a car and look at its style, and you kind of inherently know how old it is. And that's because the styles of cars have relatively slowly changed, over time. And they're in different eras, different, generations or decades or years. There's a kind of a style that is in vogue, that's popular. And we see that this is an inherent process to all human societies. They make things with certain kinds of styles, and they copy one another, they transmit this information. And so we get that same pattern in the archaeological record. People make pottery with certain kinds of decorations on it. Older, like Roman pottery, looks very different than, let's say, medieval pottery, because of the styles that people use, the technologies, how they made those pots. And so seriation can also tell us how we can see changes in styles, and we can kind of date something based on its style, but we might not know exactly how old it is exactly. It's just it's older or younger than something else that we find. Then on the other hand, we get what archaeologists call absolute dating techniques. And so these are more like, we can look at or analyze an object and say, it dates to approximately, because we almost never have like exact, but June we could 12th. Say, 6,242, BC. We generally don't have that kind of precision. Instead, all dating, even these absolute dating techniques, they have errors associated with them. Some are better, plus or minus 10 years. Others are plus or minus 1,000 years. But they give us a date. So that might be 1,000 BC, or it might be 10,000 BC or years ago. So and those, probably some of your listeners may have heard things like radiocarbon dating. This is probably the most common technique that archaeologists use. And it's based on the principle that things absorb carbon from the atmosphere. It only works for things that absorb carbon from the atmosphere. So a plant photosynthesizes, it's got to make sugars to survive. It through photosynthesis absorbs carbon, or carbon dioxide really, and then it gets rid of the oxygen and keeps the carbon. Then it uses that to make its leaves and bark and other roots and other parts of the plant. Some animals come along, they don't photosynthesize, but they need carbon to make proteins, and so they eat the plant, and they absorb that carbon that comes from the atmosphere. Well, that kind of carbon, it turns out we can use a technique called radiocarbon dating, because there's an isotope, a particular type of carbon called carbon-14. It is a carbon molecule with 14 neutrons and 6 protons. All carbons have 6 protons, but this one is unstable because it has 14 neutrons and it wants to decay, and it does that at a known rate. And so we can take advantage of that known rate of decay in carbon-14 to know how old, how long ago whatever it is that we're dating was absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. So if we get like a bone of a cat, let's say, that cat was probably eating maybe other mice or something like that. Those mice were eating plants that were absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. So that carbon in the cat bone represents carbon that was in the atmosphere at that time. Once the cat dies, it's no longer absorbing carbon, and so any of the radiocarbon that's in the bone starts to decay, and we can measure that and get an estimate of how long ago that cat lived. So, but by the same token, if you pick up a rock outside, it's probably going to have carbon in it, but that carbon, even though humans make lots of stone tools. They have for millions of years. Humans have made stone tools. They might pick up a rock and turn it into a tool. Well, there's going to be carbon in that rock, and potentially we could radiocarbon date that rock. But what we're really dating is the age of the rock, whereas what we really want to date is when did somebody turn that into a tool.
Right.
So the archaeologist is interested, when did that rock become a tool? Because that's related to humans. A geologist would be interested, how old is that rock? And so we have to be careful at how we apply these dating techniques, things like radiocarbon. You need to have knowledge about what it is that you're dating, make sure that it relates to the thing that you're trying to understand, which is, in this case, the human behavior. So there's a lot of, there's a lot of information, a lot of knowledge that goes into using these different dating techniques. And by the same token, so radiocarbon dating is one, but there's other absolute dating techniques. There's a technique called obsidian hydration dating. There's a technique called archaeomagnetic dating. There's a technique called luminescence dating. All of these sort of work with different kinds of materials. So radiocarbon dating is dependent on atmospheric carbon being present in something. Usually that means it's an organic material. Luminescence dating works on a different principle that relates to absorption of radiation from the environment. And so it's a different physical property, a different process, but it allows us to date things like pottery. In some cases, we can date pottery using a technique called luminescence dating. And obsidian hydration dating works with obsidian artifacts, as the name implies. So we have lots of, this is, because it's so important, archaeologists have teamed a lot with physicists and geologists to come up with different dating techniques to help us control for time.
Wow. And there's a lot of stuff to date things, it sounds like. Maybe that's one of the reasons why archaeology is associated with so many different fields, because there's so much geology, sounds like, maybe like a little history, like physics, like you said.
Yeah.
So I think it'd be cool to go through an example. Let's say someone finds a stone Native American arrowhead in their backyard.
Right.
I imagine if they dig that up and oh, hey, look at this. What was this from? Imagine you shouldn't have dug it up because now we lost exactly when it's from. So in a perfect scenario, how would we find out how old that's Native American arrowhead is?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for a non-archaeologist or who wants to know how old is that Native American arrowhead, probably the worst thing you could do is pull it out of the site, drive it down to the university, and then ask the archaeologist, hey, how old is this thing? There's some things we can say, because it turns out arrowheads also change stylistically over time. So I could probably look at that arrowhead and I might be able to tell you within 1,000 years or so how old it is, roughly. It depends on the shape. Because again, just like with cars, in certain time periods, people make arrowheads with different shapes to them, or different notches, like that have corner notches or side notches. That's the hafting part to attach it to the arrow. Okay, so I could tell you a little bit based on maybe the style, but then if it's obsidian, then we can do something called obsidian hydration, which is so when this is true of all glasses. There's a physical process that happens that there are molecules inside of the glass. They're called hydroxyl HO atoms, or molecules, HO atoms inside the glass, and they want to become water, H2O. So they hydrate, they take in hydrogen from the ambient environment. And that's a chemical reaction, and it happens at a particular rate of time. So obsidian, which is a glass, it's a natural volcanic glass. When you take a chunk of obsidian and you break it open, you flint knap it to make it into your arrowhead, you remove all of the exposed surface, and you're sort of exposing the inner part of that rock. The moment you do that, this hydration process starts taking place, and it happens at like we're talking about a scale of microns or tenths of microns. But slowly it will absorb hydrogen. It hydrates. And so we can look at the thickness, the amount of hydrogen that's been absorbed in that obsidian artifact. And if there's a lot of it, it means it's old. And if there's very little, it means it's young. But we can do even better. We can sort of get we measure the thickness in microns. We can get an estimate of, it's 520 years plus or minus 50 years or something like that. So we would have that option if it was obsidian. If it's not obsidian, then we can't do that. And then we're usually talking about dating things that are in association. So let's say, and this is where we don't want to pull it out of the site and bring it down to the university because it's lost its context. And like I said before, like archaeological sites oftentimes have layers in them. Well, if that arrowhead comes from a particular layer and you record exactly where it comes from, there could be some charcoal or some organic material right next to that arrowhead, in which case you could get a radiocarbon date on the charcoal that's next to the arrowhead, and then assuming they're in association with one another and they're in context, you indirectly get a radiocarbon date estimate of the obsidian or the arrowhead.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the lesson here sounds like if you find something on the ground, leave it there and call an archaeologist.
Yes. Yeah. You want to leave it there and call an archaeologist so that they can study things in their original context. I mean, not only for dating, but also for understanding behavior. So you might imagine an arrowhead, or let's say like a coin. A coin can have very different behavioral meanings depending on what it's associated with. So like a coin might be it might be found in a fountain. That the behavioral meaning of a coin in a fountain indicates somebody maybe making a wish, or it indicates some kind of probably ritual type of behavior. Yeah. But a coin that you might find like in a cash register, it has a different meaning to a behavioral meaning. It's about purchasing something. It's a very different kind of behavioral meaning. Once you remove an artifact from its context, is it in a house? Is it in a fountain? Is it in a shrine or some kind of context? Once you remove it from the context, it loses a lot of the behavioral meaning we might get out of it, and so we lose that information, and that's really what archaeology is about. And this, we may get into this in a little bit, but what archaeology is truly about is not about artifacts, and like we don't really care if something's made out of gold or something's made out of stone or something's made out of clay. What's important to an archaeologist is the behavioral information that object carries, and its its age and what it tells us about what life was like, what people were using that thing for, because that tells us about life, and it tells us about how human behavior, how human culture has evolved over time. We want to know whether that coin is used for buying things, or whether it's used for making wishes, or whether it's used to to decide who gets the opening kickoff in a football game or something. Like, we want to know what that coin, what its behavioral meaning was. Again, we don't care if it's gold coin or whether that doesn't matter to us. The real value is what it means for understanding human behavior. So the objects themselves don't carry any inherent value. And this is very different than art history and some other fields where it's, the object is really the focus. It's the object itself that's of value. Art appreciation, these kinds of fields, they look at objects from the past differently. Somebody who has a private collection of stuff, they maybe put some old pots on their fireplace mantle. They like to look at them because maybe it carries some kind of significance for them that's associated with where they see their ancestry, or is from, or something like that. But to an archaeologist, we're really worried about, or we're really interested in other properties or other values of artifacts.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
When you're saying that, it almost feels like an analogy would be like, if you ask someone like, "Oh, tell me about yourself," and they were like, "I was born in 2001." And you're like, okay, well, there's a little more to it than just how old you are,
Right.
It's like the same with artifacts, and seeing the whole picture of a person and humanity was just one little detail about it.
Right, and maybe that also makes me think, if you say, if the only thing you tell somebody is I was born in 2001, if you don't know the context, maybe something about the context of 2001, like these in 2001 people were driving these kinds of cars, or people were playing these kinds of video games, or it might tell you something about if this person was born in 2001, in 2025 or 2020, we went through the pandemic, and so it might tell you something about, that person was 20 years old or 19 years old during the pandemic. They probably experienced the pandemic in a particular way rather than somebody who was born in 2010. The context there is important. We want to know what it's associated with, what your birth, is associated with.
Yeah. It sounds like there's so many methods of dating things in the past, but I'm curious how archaeology might function in 1,000 years from now, where everything's digital. I have this notebook in front of me, but I have it because it's a decomposition book, and I feel like it's pretty cool. But most of my stuff's in Google Drive, and all my text on my phone, pictures on my phone, and I think hard drives can stop working in 10 to 15 years if use them enough. So I'm curious, has the field kind of explored what archaeology might look like in, let's say, 100, 500, 1,000 years from now, where everything's almost completely digital?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, archaeologists have thought about these things. Of course, archivists and others, historians, have thought a lot about this as well. And there's I don't know how that's going to play out. Of course, it's hard to predict the future, but I think it will be very challenging. I still think we have enough of a material world around us now that even if some of the details are lost, and if we think about a society 2,000 years ago, let's say, the things that are left over from that culture is only a very, very small fraction of what was originally there. All the language, the words, ceremonies, religions, and all those things are all gone. What we're left with are the bits of material culture, maybe refuse from food that they ate, some pots, maybe the foundations of the houses they lived in. There's if let's say it's a puzzle, the whole culture is a puzzle, we've got maybe, 100, if it was a 100-piece puzzle, we've got maybe like 5 or 6 pieces of that puzzle. And as archaeologists, we're trying to sort of connect the bits that we have together and try to fill in the missing pieces. And I think in the future, archaeologists will have that same problem. Yeah, we'll lose all the digital information that we're currently saving, but there'll be enough of bits and pieces that do survive that I think they'll also have a puzzle. I don't know how many pieces they'll have, but they're going to have to fill in those pieces using different techniques that are going to be available to them in 500 years.
Yeah, makes sense. Imagine go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, but one thing I do know that won't be available to them is radiocarbon dating.
Oh, why is that?
And the reason why radiocarbon dating won't work, so I mentioned, plants, the way that radiocarbon dating works is based on atmospheric carbon. Well, about 50 years ago, well, even longer now, I guess about 70 years ago, humans started doing something to the atmosphere, changing the atmosphere, and especially in terms of the amount of radiocarbon that was in the atmosphere. That as you're guessing, is about 70 years ago is when there was a lot of atomic bomb testing, and tremendous amounts of radiocarbon were spewed out into the atmosphere as a result of bomb testing, atmospheric bomb testing, the Soviet Union and the United States. And because of that, there's a huge spike in the amount of radiocarbon that was in the atmosphere, which means that if you date anything that is like 1950 or later, you can't tell how old it is because there's atmospheric radiocarbon from bomb testing in all organic material. So, like if you drink wine, actually, like a wine from 1955 will have a whole bunch of extra radiocarbon in there.
Wow.
I mean, it's you're not going to die of radiation poisoning or anything, but it's going to have a whole bunch of extra radiocarbon in there because the grapes that we're growing were absorbing that radiocarbon, and so we can no longer use radiocarbon dating for anything that's like younger anything that's younger than about 1950, and so we've sort of ruined, or we collectively have ruined radiocarbon dating for archaeologists of the future.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah. The other thing that we've done is also we've put out tremendous amounts of fossil carbon by burning fossil fuels, really, really old carbon into the atmosphere, and that's also kind of mucked up radiocarbon dating for archaeologists of the future. So a lot of anthropogenic effects to the atmosphere have ruined some, or have made it probably impossible for archaeologists to be using these techniques in the future.
Interesting.
They'll have to come up with other techniques.
Oppenheimer didn't mention this. So
no, he wasn't worried about effects on archaeology.
Out of curiosity, now that you bring that up, do you know how long it would take for it to go back to a baseline where we could use that radiocarbon dating?
So the technical answer to that question is never.
Wow.
Because there's a technical answer to that question and then a practical answer to that question. The technical answer is never, because the way that radiocarbon dating works is that it operates on something called a half-life. So in the case of carbon-14, radiocarbon, about every 5,500 years, a little bit longer, about every 5,500 years, you lose half of the radiocarbon that's there. So, but if you think about it, right, you can never get to zero. There's never zero radiocarbon left, because you're always dividing in half and half and half and half and half, and you never get to zero. So all this radiocarbon that went up into the atmosphere due to bomb testing, it will always be there because it never gets to exactly to zero. Now, practically, it gets to a point where probably there's less of it left than what we can measure using any technique today. But given that the half-life of radiocarbon is 5,500 years, it's going to be like 50,000 years or more before it practically gets back to baseline levels.
So yeah, probably not practically going to happen,
Yeah, well, and that actually, what I say is not exactly true, because it's not just staying in the atmosphere. It's also being absorbed out of the atmosphere. So my actual answer is in terms of the carbon cycle on Earth, it will never completely disappear from the carbon cycle on Earth, but it's getting removed out of the atmosphere pretty quickly through photosynthesis. I forget what the average amount of time that a carbon atom spends in the atmosphere, but it's there's this cycle of constantly being photosynthesized, being pulled, fixated out of the atmosphere, and then being returned back to the atmosphere.
I wonder if carbon capture would change that at all. The systems, well, not just trees, but man-made carbon capture where they try to keep it in the ground. I wonder if that would impact it at all.
Yeah, it would. We would be pulling out tremendous amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere, and putting it back underground, and it would certainly have some kind of effect.
Yeah. So archaeology will be challenging during climate change and after climate change, anthropogenic climate change, of course. Something you study is how species have adapted over time, human species, to be clear.
Yeah.
So have we adapted to changes in the past? We lived through little ice ages in the past, I believe, as species. The climate's always changing. Not to say that anthropogenic climate change isn't real. It definitely is. Yeah. But we've always lived through periods of climate change, of social changes, environmental changes, cultural changes. How have we kind of processed those as a species? How have we adapted to those?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, there's different ways to answer that question. We can look at the different time scales. We can look at millions of years, and certainly there's been tremendous amounts of biological evolution over the last 4 million years. If we ran into one of our ancestors from 4 million years ago, probably they would look human-like, but we definitely would not recognize it as, like we are. And then there's, much shorter time scales, the last 100 years or 200 years or 1,000 years. And yeah, there's, sort of climate and environmental changes that have happened over much shorter scales. The thing that we know, let's say over the last 50,000 or 100,000 years, is that humans have, so if we dug up a skeleton of a human from 100,000 years ago, it would look almost the same as you and I today.
Is it 100,000 years ago?
100,000 years ago, yeah. And it would depend a little bit on where we dug that up. So if we dug up a human in, let's say, Europe or East Asia 100,000 years ago, it would be, like a Neanderthal. Neanderthals have some slight differences anatomically compared to modern humans, but by and large, they would look very human. Like we would probably recognize this as a human. And there's debate about, whether Neanderthals could speak. Certainly, they did a lot of things that we recognize as distinctively human. And one of the things I like to talk about in my class, so all living humans today can trace back their ancestry to relatively recently, like probably about 100,000 years ago. That's where that number came back from, where that number comes from. We're all one species. We're incredibly similar. Biologically, genetically, we are incredibly similar. The ways that we are different, we certainly do recognize lots of differences globally among different human populations, but really the ways we are different are not biological, they're entirely cultural. And this is the other way that humans adapt to social conditions and environmental conditions. So it's very easy for humans to live in all kinds of different environments today. There's humans who live in the Arctic, there's humans who live in deserts, there's humans who live at high altitude, there's humans who live, in coastal environments. We live everywhere. We are one of the few species that have colonized sort of the globe. Incidentally, it's kind of fun to think about the other species that have done this. A lot of them are species that cohabitate with humans. So like lice, human lice, for example, various kinds of parasites, intestinal worms, pinworms, and things like that are also global because we've carried them with us throughout the globe. But, and then, things like dogs, for example, and cats today, like they're sort of global species. But that's because we've we've brought them with us. We use culture to, how do we live at high altitudes or in the Arctic? We use culture. We don't need to evolve a fur, a thick layer of hair to survive in the Arctic. We make clothing. We build houses. We're incredibly inventive and adaptive to allow us to live in these vastly different climates, and we create these crazy environments, cities and urban centers. Those are all very recent in human history, like only probably the last 5, 6, 7,000 years that we are really living in urban environments. But those are very different human constructed environments that we have to adapt to socially and and probably psychologically, that we have to adapt to these kinds of environments. But we're not the only species certainly to have culture and to use tools to adapt to different environments. But certainly we do that to a much greater extent than any other species on Earth does. And so that's how I think in the coming decades with climate change, which is happening, we're going to have to lean on our creativity as humans and our problem-solving skills as humans to adapt to this, to changing environments. As an archaeologist, I'm not confident that we learn very well from history, that we can easily correct things that we're doing. We usually just kind of adapt, modify our culture to be able to continue to live in a particular environment. We're not very good at like changing things, or we're not very good at like correcting things that we see as mistakes. If that sort of makes sense, what I'm saying. But so I think in areas where it's going to be really hot, we're going to need a lot more energy and have air conditioning and build houses certain ways, live a lot more indoors. Maybe any outdoor work we need to do is we'll have to adapt and do that at night or something when it's cooler. But there are going to be lots of adaptations we'll have to make in coastal environments, whether it's building dikes or whether it's putting our houses on stilts or something. We will adapt in lots of ways that will sort of depend on local circumstances. But that's what we've always done. We've always, as a species, the collective we, as a species, have always adapted to different conditions, different diseases that have spread through human cultures, or different kinds of technologies, or different settlement patterns. We adapt. We're good at coming up with solutions.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying is basically that we've always adapted as a species and individually. I mean, the example that comes to mind is that any baby can learn any language, which is a crazy thing if you really think about it. Like, any person can learn any language when they're a child and they just automatically pick it up. They pick up habits, they pick up other things in their culture, so we'll always change. But maybe in this case of climate change, we have so many people on Earth, maybe it'll be rough to change. Maybe if you go outside in the day, you'll get burnt within an hour and you'll have to ration your water. So maybe these changes won't be very good.
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm discouraged about humans is not that we can't do these things, because I think we can. It's just the coordination that involves, and our inherent psychology to sort of create this like us and them way of viewing the world being, and that's probably in our evolutionary past, this was advantageous to be mistrustful of people who weren't part of your group, like the people that you hung out with that you could trust, that you were dependent upon. And so, but the people over there, maybe you're a little bit mistrustful of them. We easily apply that model to conditions today, and so we're mistrustful of people who don't speak the same language of us, or people who dress differently than we do, or who have a different religion, or all manner of ways that we like to divide ourselves up into categories. That and sometimes commit atrocities against other people who you see as others, and not part of your group. And to me, that's a bigger challenge. Like, how can we get along to solve these big problems, to come up with adaptations to climate change, or there's going to be other things as we modify our environment. How can we kind of get along, and how can we? Because again, it's not biology. We're essentially all the same. Any human is like shares 99.99% of their DNA with any other human, so we're not different biologically. We're different culturally, and that to me is a big challenge. But that leads me into another. I think this is why I got interested in archaeology. Because I think that archaeology can be part of the solution to this kind of like tribalistic view of the world. Like, archaeology can expose people to other cultures, other ways of living, other ways of behaving, and kind of normalize that, or show how amazing other cultures were. The whole reason why I got into archaeology was I felt like it was an opportunity to study other people, and like bring that to the public, to show how amazing, the way that I was exposed to archaeology is, like a lot of people, sort of Roman archaeology, Greek archaeology, Egyptian archaeology, and I'm like, but there's so many more cultures around the world. I want to study these other cultures because they're every bit as interesting, every bit as important. And these other cultures did amazing things too, that maybe they didn't build pyramids, they're not as visible, but they did these amazing things that had amazing adaptations to different, ice ages, or different environments. And I felt like it was my training. I could do that. I could like talk about, this is really cool how people in the deserts of California, how Native Americans made a living in this environment, and the amazing cultures that they had, and like I could bring this and show how it was just different, but every bit as interesting. And so that's kind of how I got into archaeology, I thought. Part of that's an upbringing too of I grew up in the 1970s, 1980s, and in the United States, and it was, there was a lot of, then in the 1970s, 1980s, there was a lot of discussion about, well, we need to everybody needs to have equal opportunities. All people of different backgrounds, different cultures need to have equal opportunities. And I felt, again, like culture sometimes gets in the way of that, viewing other people as different, or, not trustful. And so there was a lot of messaging in the 1970s, 1980s about, all people are equal and we need to treat everybody needs to have the same opportunities. And so I think, that kind of became a part of me. And so I thought this is one way that I can do that, to study other cultures other than the big ones that archaeologists have traditionally studied. I can study other cultures and sort of explore and try to bring that to the general population.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think studying anthropology, at least for me, like gives rise to a certain worldview that, like you said, we're all very similar. We're all different in different ways, but also extremely similar. We all love, we all cry laughing, we all cry sadly, we all make beautiful structures, we all write amazing stories, we do all this cool stuff, and if we come together, we definitely can solve all our problems.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's what drew me to anthropology and drew me, especially to archaeology. And I feel like that was my that was my sort of calling, I guess, in some way. That's what I wanted to do.
That's nice. That's great. Yeah.
And we have a lot to learn from each other, and it's very easy to sort of get into this ethnocentric way of viewing things. And I think it's a natural kind of progression to start out as kind of ethnocentric and focus inward. But as you get older and you're exposed to more people and more things in the world, you can, come to an appreciation for, I hope, an appreciation for other ways of doing, other ways of behaving, and come to say, maybe that's not how my parents or grandparents did that, but this is really cool. I want to learn about that and share in that in some way.
And ethnocentric being like seeing your own culture as valid and important, and then viewing other cultures through the lens of your culture, right? Like saying like, my culture uses forks, they don't, therefore they're bad or weird, stuff like that.
Yeah, it's the sort of the fear of others, the fear of people doing things differently. So they use their hands and to eat food, and maybe that's dirty in some way or something. But the only way to get around that, I think, is to see it and maybe experience part of that yourself. And maybe you experience that through directly, you travel or something, or maybe it's through going to a museum or reading a book or seeing a movie or something. There's lots of ways to experience other cultures to broaden your horizons, and again, not be fearful of other people who do things differently, but to appreciate, say, oh wow, that's really, never thought of it that way. That's really interesting and amazing, and let's try to work together. Yeah,
it's very easy to judge from behind the computer screen or phone screen or something, but there were so many cases where I've gone to a place or experienced something, and people say, oh, that's horrible, and that's like, I'll use specifics like San Francisco. People say, it's not a great place anymore, it's overrun, all that kind of stuff. But I think it's a beautiful city with lots of culture. Same with things all around the world. I've lived in North Carolina for a little bit, very conservative area. It's gorgeous, people are friendly. The day after we moved in there, people bake cookies for us. Whereas you might think of like, oh, Southerners are kind of like, mean and xenophobic and all that. They're very nice people.
Yeah.
So experiencing culture shapes you for sure.
Yeah, and I think that humans in general want to be like we are. We have evolved to want to be cooperative. It's just that sometimes we're fearful of maybe cooperating with people that we don't understand or that we don't trust, because they might take advantage of us in some way. And so this sort of fear builds up, and sometimes that leads to warfare or violence or other. I think most humans can agree. We want to be happy. We want to be safe, and what happiness, is, or how we express happiness, or how we experience happiness, can vary quite a bit. But I don't know. I don't want anybody to be sad or to be angry, or I don't want those things. And so I don't know. Maybe it's maybe it's wishful thinking on my part, but I do feel like archaeology can play a role in that way to make the world a better place, to bring appreciation to cultures of people past, of course, past, but also present, to bring a greater appreciation. And it is a way to bring us potentially together.
Yeah. Cooperation is in our blood. This is just one study, so take it with a grain of salt. But I heard about a study where they had 2 babies, and they gave one of the babies like a bunch of, or maybe it was a toddler, maybe a very young child, one of them a bunch of food, and the other one no food. And then the baby who got a lot of food felt guilty and give either half the food or some of the food to the other person, or give all the food to the other person. So maybe before we're maybe programmed to be a bit more fearful and anxious outsiders, we have an inherent desires to want to be cooperative and helpful and help others.
For sure, yeah. I mean, that I think that was super important, and it continues to be super important to be cooperative, and we do amazing things. We truly do amazing things when we cooperate. So coming up with, or at least things that I think are amazing, the cures to diseases and the internet or other kinds of things, those are pretty amazing human accomplishments that require tremendous amounts of cooperation.
Yeah. Well, speaking of cooperation, I want to transition into some more light topics. Speaking of cooperation, the British Museum.
Yes.
Maybe not the most cooperative. For those that don't know, a bit of a backstory is the British Museum, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but the British Museum is one of the largest museums in Britain. It's in London, I believe.
Yep.
And they have a collection of artifacts from around the world. You'll hear some of the artifacts, this is in the British Museum, this is the British Museum, stored in the British Museum. I believe part of, is it the Pantheon in Greece, is it there?
Parthenon, yeah.
Parthenon.
Yep.
Even though Greece has asked for it back multiple times. And I think that Britain, or the British Museum specifically, I want to categorize all people, but the British Museum might say, well, we do want people to have their artifacts, but we're kind of worried that if we give it to these, they would probably say less developed countries. I disagree with that term, but I'm guessing that's what they would say. If we give these other countries, there's a risk of it getting damaged forever. So what are your thoughts on the British Museum and generally countries preserving artifacts on behalf of others?
Yeah, so this is this is a big can of worms, and there's lots of diverse opinions about this. So it's true, and lots of museums in the late 1800s, mid 1800s, late 1800s, a lot of these museums were founded, and they wanted to create collections of materials that people would come and view and do research with also, because a lot of those museums did also have labs associated with them where they would have scholars who they work at the museum, create displays, but also do research to learn about those materials. I think in some ways, I guess museums and archaeology is kind of a victim of its own success, in that certainly museums were successful because once they developed the British Museum, and in Berlin there was a museum, and mostly starting in Europe. But once people saw this and how successful it was, these museums started appearing everywhere, globally, around the world. And in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a lot of museums wanted to have a global collection. So they wanted some artifacts from China, they wanted some artifacts from Indonesia, some artifacts from South America. They wanted to have collections from all over the world so they could put them on display, and so that did lead to, in some cases, kind of unethical behaviors. So they would hire archaeologists to go out and essentially loot archaeological sites, or buy. Museums would be buying artifacts that were looted, so without consent from other nations or local communities. They would go out and essentially steal these artifacts and bring them back to the museum. And this has continued on. I hope that it doesn't happen very much anymore today, but now in the last 30, 40 years, there's been kind of backlash, and a lot of countries are like, hey, we realize now that those collections you have were taken illegally. We didn't give permission for those things to leave our country, our nation. And so there's an effort in many places of countries to repatriate, to bring back artifacts. And the British Museum has been kind of the center of that because they're huge, and the British Empire was huge, and they brought back a lot of things from lots of colonies around the world. And I understand that. So like one of the most famous cases is the marbles from the Parthenon. They're sometimes referred to as the Elgin marbles, although that's because Lord Elgin was responsible for packing up stuff from the Parthenon onto a boat and shipping it out.
Just wrote his name on it.
Yeah, and so there's one argument from museums to say, yeah, well, and it is true. So those Elgin marbles, and I think, the Elgin marbles were under threat, I think, at the time. There's like wars and things happening, so one argument might be, yeah, we're protecting them, but that's a little paternalistic to say, or protecting it because Greek people can't take care of it. But it is also true, I think, I'm not an expert on these marbles, the Parthenon marbles, but I think like one of the ships sank somewhere. So even, you're protecting it, but actually you lost a whole bunch of them too.
Wow.
They had to be taken in like multiple ships. And there are lots of other very valuable or things that, and again, I think in this archaeology is a bit a victim of its own success, that there is a lot of value seen in these artifacts, and so countries want them maybe in their own, but like that represents our national heritage. We want them here in our country, and I completely understand that perspective, but I do think that I think again, the world doesn't have to be black and white. There are shades of gray, and I think there's some medium places, shades of gray we can get to, because I do think there's value for, let's say, Greece, the country of Greece, to have artifacts and things in museums around the world, because it brings, people go and maybe they see the marbles in the British Museum. Maybe some of those people are like, yeah, I want to go and I want to see, I want to go to Greece, or I want to learn more about this, and and that might promote something like tourism, which can bring money into a country. Tourism has its good and bad. It's a double-edged sword a lot of times, but it does bring like notoriety. I mean, who doesn't know about what kid in the United States? When you ask any kid about the country of Egypt, probably the first thing almost everybody's going to say is like pyramids and mummies and gold and pharaohs and things, and yeah, that's true. But that might be like an opening to learn more about modern day Egypt, or to visit the country and experience. Yeah, you might experience the antiquities in Egypt, but you might also experience modern day Egyptian culture, and learn about the people there and what life is like today in Egypt. And so I do think there's value like in having materials from other countries. Maybe somebody living in England can't afford to go to Greece or Egypt, and the only way they're ever going to learn about this is by visiting the British Museum or some local museum or something. So I do think that there's value in like having these things around the world. You could also make the argument, like what happened in Iraq after after the ISIS sort of expanded, and they went through and looted these, and it, blew up statues of ancient sites. They looted museums, and so there is something to be said about, again, not being paternalistic to Iraq, but to have things kind of distributed around the world rather than everything in one place. There's another tragic example too in Brazil. Their national museum burned, and tons and tons of artifacts and other things were lost because the whole museum, burned. So, I think there's value in sort of having things distributed, some things distributed around the world as parts of collective human ancestry. We're all very similar. The amount of genetic difference between any two humans on Earth anywhere is minuscule. And so there's also an argument to say, well, the histories of Greece and Egypt and California and Australia, different places, different countries around the world, is not just the history of people who trace some or all of their ancestry to those places, but it's a collective, global human history that we all share and can learn from. And so I think that right now a lot of museums like the British Museum are in the crosshairs of a lot of political and social challenges, but and it's easy to villainize them and point to them as you're the problem, that you're everything that's wrong. But I think that that's too far, and that there's value to museums, and that there's gray areas where places we can come together and try to. We've got different goals, and try to come to a place where we can have some kind of shared goals where everybody benefits. And the British Museum isn't saying no, we're not turning anything, but also not saying, okay, then we're emptying out the British Museum and there's nothing but things from Britain in British Museum. I think that also doesn't serve us as a global community.
Yeah, that seems like a very well-rounded answer to a difficult issue.
Yeah.
I think, I agree. There's a lot of value in, the British Museum being rich and being able to have temperature-controlled rooms, and I imagine they have probably extremely strong glass behind their artifacts, and they carefully calibrate the lighting, I imagine, whereas other places might not be able to afford that. So I think there's definitely value in that. I just hope that if there is an issue where a country, I believe that bust of Nefertiti is in the British Museum from Egypt, and let's say Egypt doesn't want that back. I would just hope that there's some kind of agreement they come to, whether that's maybe, I don't know, royalties maybe from the British Museum paid back to Egypt, or returning it, or some British artifacts in Egypt. Probably different solutions to each country, but I hope that there's some collaboration where everyone can be happy.
Yeah, or maybe Egypt owns those materials, but the British Museum can keep them on loan for some indefinite amount of time. There's lots of potential solutions to this, and again, they're valuable. I do think that there's value in seeing the real thing, seeing the Rosetta Stone. I've seen the Rosetta Stone. It's pretty amazing.
I'm jealous.
It's kind of cool to see the real thing. And some people say, "Oh, I'll just make casts of everything, and then that will solve the problem." But I think there's something to having the bona fide Mona Lisa or the bona fide Rosetta Stone. Those are things to that is valuable. But maybe it needs to travel around and not only be in the British Museum, but other people should have a chance to see the Rosetta Stone too. Can't travel to the British Museum.
That's true. Yeah. Like I said, hopefully just some collaboration, and hopefully we find solutions where everyone wins. That's the ideal.
Yeah. And again, it's good to get different viewpoints, get lots of different viewpoints, and give them equal weights, and try to come to some solutions of And I'm sure that I don't work at the British Museum in particular, but I'm sure that that is happening to some extent. But
Right.
it's an enormous issue for the British Museum because they have so many things from, probably a couple centuries of collecting that makes it a big, like it's not something that one or two museum curators can deal with.
True, yeah. I brought up the British Museum because it's probably the most infamous example, but we have the Smithsonian in America. We have plenty of other museums out there, but it's an issue with everything.
Yes, yeah, it's true. And we like to think of museums as these like permanent places, like, it goes there and is there forever, but nothing, one thing you learn as an archaeologist is like we shouldn't have that viewpoint because nothing is forever.
That's true.
Like I said, the National Museum in Brazil burned down, and we have a museum here at UC Davis. It could, earthquake or something, it could collapse or a fire or, like nothing's forever. So, and I think we need to kind of take that perspective as well.
Yeah, that sounds very fair.
Yeah.
With the limited time we have, I think I'd like to shift a little bit and do a more fun thing.
Okay.
So I want you to pretend that I'm, let's say, the distinguished professor of anthropology one day, but let's say for now.
Yes.
And I'm contacting you because my university has an opening for a professor of archaeology. And we have kind of 5 candidates ready. And we're not sure what to do for each of them. So we want to see, well, we have multiple positions, but we have like 5 candidates who want to join. I want you to let us know if we should hire them or deny them.
Okay.
Okay, so first off, we have Indiana Jones. So the pros with him. Indiana, there he is. The pros are that he popularized archaeology and left a positive image of the field. I mean, I will say that one of the first careers I wanted to be was archaeologist because of him and all the Lego sets of him. And seeing The Dial of Destiny, although it's an okay movie, it did bring back my childhood a little bit. Another pro is that he says artifacts belong in museums, not private collections, which I totally agree with. And he's a very engaging and knowledgeable professor, as you see in the show. The cons are that he cares about, quote, fortune and glory very explicitly and treasure hunting. He also very famously can leave sites damaged or destroyed entirely. He'll prioritize the shiny artifacts over maybe a little clay pot that has a lot about a story. And he can dismiss indigenous people and what they've done. So should we hire him or should we just ignore him?
Well, as a professional archaeologist, I would say no, we're not going to hire Indiana Jones. And the main reason why is that we talked earlier about what archaeologists do, what the goals of archaeology are. And the goals of archaeology are to understand human behavior and the evolution of humans. And my main issue with Indiana Jones, as much as he's done to popularize archaeology, which I totally appreciate, and yeah, I saw, again, I was born in born 1969, and so I saw Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark when I was a kid, and it made a big impression on me for sure. But he's not interested in human behavior. Probably, if you've seen the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, there's like that opening scene, fantastic, super entertaining. I love India, I love the movie. But he goes into this tomb and he's like, dodging. There's all kinds of challenges, right? There's arrows shooting at him from the side. There's this pit, he almost falls into, and there's the tarantulas. And anyway, he gets to the end, and there's this gold idol, and all he cares about is like getting that gold idol so that it can go into a museum. And the whole tomb, after he takes the gold idol and he misjudges, I think, the weight of the gold idol when he puts that bag of sand on there, he got it wrong. And like the tomb, the thing goes down, the pedestal that the idol was on goes down, and the tomb falls apart, and there's that big rolling rock and stuff. And he didn't care about the tomb. The tomb is destroyed. But all he cared about was like that gold statue to get it into a museum. And no archaeologist would behave like that. I would be like, the gold statue, the gold idol is like almost inconsequential to the rest of that tomb. Well, like, what does that tomb tell us about humans and human behavior, that people would put all these, like, booby traps in there to prevent anybody from getting in there? That says a lot about the values that culture had, and like these amazing technologies, like if like there's that one scene where he like puts his hand through the sun and then like darts fly out from the side. Like, that is an amazing technology. I want to know how those people figured that out, or like, like all these things are amazing technologies you would want to try to understand in its context. And so Indiana Jones is really more concerned with the things, and he's not concerned with the behaviors. And so for that reason, I'm probably not going to hire Indiana Jones, or I'm not going to vote for Indiana Jones to join my university. Sorry, Indy.
Sorry, Indy.
And I mean, he's incredibly knowledgeable. It's true. Like I think a lot of people get this idea. There's like scenes where they ask him, I think he's like giving a lecture, or somebody pulls out a notebook and says something about some particular site, and he can rattle off all this information about, it's 5.6 meters tall, and it's, like it dates exactly to this year. He's like rattling off all this information, and no archaeologist that I know has that kind of like recall, knows information like that. We're really more at a kind of higher level, like interested in humans and human cultures, how they operate. We don't, those kinds of details. And students sometimes are surprised I can't tell them, I don't know, like off the top of my head, what year, King Tut was born or something, or no, I don't know. I know like approximately when, but I don't know the exact year. I don't have that kind of information. So Indiana Jones is, knows a lot, but ethically doesn't share my concerns for my interest in human behavior.
That's fair. Sorry, Indy.
Sorry.
You're already a professor at some other university, right? I believe.
Yeah.
I forget the name of it.
Fictitious university, yeah. It's interesting. So actually, the scenes in Raiders of the Lost Ark where he's at the university were actually shot here in it looks like an Ivy League kind of school. I think that's what it's supposed to be, Harvard or somewhere like that. But it's actually shot at University of the Pacific, which is in Stockton, just like an hour here from Davis.
I know that.
Yeah, which has sort of like that feel, or some of the buildings have that sort of Ivy League feel to them. But
wow.
Anyway.
Little fun fact.
Yeah, fun fact.
Okay, well, we won't bring him on.
Okay.
But next for consideration is Lara Croft.
Lara Croft.
Her pros are that she's passionate about archaeology in the past, and she has effective methods of finding artifacts, if you consider that a pro. But the cons are that she's an explicit treasure hunter. She damages sites like Indiana Jones. She prioritizes shiny stuff over that which tell our story as humans. And she's sometimes portrayed as self-taught, other times portrayed as coming from an archaeological family and having a degree, but she might not have any formal training. So what are your thoughts? Should we hire her or no?
Yeah, I'm probably going to have to pass on Laura as well. And again, it's her concern for objects, and not objects as objects. The value, like if you had two idols and one was gold and one was made out of clay, the gold one is somehow way more valuable inherently because it's gold. And to an archaeologist, that wouldn't matter. And also, I mean, really, most of my time as an archaeologist, I sit behind the computer or I'm in the lab.
You don't have arrows on your back at all times, or?
Yeah, I never have arrows on my back.
You don't carry a whip or anything?
I don't have a whip. I do have a nice hat.
Oh, that's good.
Because you gotta keep the sun off your face. It's really her concern with like objects, and not a concern with human behavior. I'm not so worried that she's self-taught. That doesn't bother me as much, but her lack of writing ability and lab skills might turn me off to Laura. Yeah.
So sorry, Laura, we're 0 for 2 now.
All right.
Okay, next is some that people might be familiar with. Bandit Healer from the show Bluey.
Okay.
The pros of him are that he's knowledgeable about archaeology. He can talk about it for an entire lecture. He uses, of course, complex terms and all that. He's genuinely interested in history, loves talking about it. And this might be his best pro. He has a PhD in archaeology.
Okay.
The cons, there's only one con, but it's a rather serious con. He's known to gnaw on bones. So, and assuming that these are kind of more, I know technically he'd be a paleontologist, I guess, because animals, but assuming that for them, humans are dogs, considered archaeologists. Anyway, would you recommend him or no?
Well, I have not seen Bandit Healer, so I don't know all the ins and outs, but him gnawing on bones might be a negative. But I don't know. What's he interested in? Is he interested in dog behavior and the evolution of dogs? If so, if that's really what about. Then I'd give him a good look. Does he write good papers? Has he got publications?
Seems like it, yeah. He seems to love digging up bones, at least.
Yeah. All right, I'll put him in the maybe pile. I got to learn a little bit more. I got to look at his resume a little more carefully.
The maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, we got two more.
All right.
One is Professor Herschel Layton, so he's already a professor of archaeology at a distinguished institution. He does his best to solve historical mysteries. That's what he really likes about archaeology. He likes solving the mystery of how and why things happened. And he focuses on ancient sites. He really does care about the past. The cons are that people say you can sometimes oversimplify archaeology and can maybe care more about the aspect of solving a puzzle rather than what he's studying. Should we hire him or no?
That sounds pretty good to me. I think that it's a skill is being able to speak to different audiences. So his dumbing down archaeology, presumably that's when he's speaking to the public, which I think is not necessarily dumbing down, but to make it consumable to people who don't have knowledge, who aren't trained in that field. I think is a very important skill, one that sometimes archaeologists don't do enough of, and leads to misunderstandings about what archaeologists do and why they do it. And again, I think that like getting back to our other candidates, Lara Croft and Indiana Jones, a lot of times in movies people see the end product, which is putting something in a museum, which is also how they consume themselves archaeology. They probably go to a museum and see these artifacts, so they might think like the ends maybe justify the means, or they don't really know the means, and so they might not see kind of how the artifact gets into the museum. But this guy solving puzzles sounds to me a little bit more like we're interested in human behaviors. I feel like I do a lot of puzzle solving, and you said he's an historian.
Archaeologist.
Historical archaeologist.
I believe it's a degree in anthropology, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of what I'm doing, my own work is sort of lately is kind of historic or forensic archaeology. Some fun cases like working where a burial is found, a human, is found, and then trying to use historical records and different analytical techniques to see if we can figure out what's that person, who is that person, what's their name, like what's their, finding them in the historical records. So that sounds intriguing to me. So I'd want to interview him and learn more about him. Sounds good to me.
We got our first interview.
All right.
Potential. Maybe also Bandit. We'll see.
Yeah,
I'll
maybe
get
Bandit.
His bone biting, but
right. If we can get him to not gnaw on the artifacts.
Exactly. Okay, we have one more.
Okay.
Dr. Liara Tassoni from Mass Effect. So this is a maybe also pretty good candidate. Her pros are that she's considered an expert in Prothean archaeology and technology. She's dedicated her life to studying archaeology, and she has a doctorate in anthropology with 50 years of research. Her cons are that she can care more about technology and history than archaeology, like the tools rather than the whole picture. And the other thing is that she is sometimes seen as too young to be reputable because her species has a lifespan of 1,000 years. So we can kind of translate her 50 years of research maybe to 5 years, although 50 years, no matter what, is still a long time.
Yeah.
So Dr. Liara, should we hire her, interview her?
Yeah, I'd like to give her an interview. I don't know the show, so is it a movie? It's a movie.
Video game, I believe.
Video game. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I have not played a video game, but her experience and her goals sound interesting to me. She sounds like she's kind of doing similar things to what I do. So yeah, I definitely would want to give her an interview.
Nice. Well, we got 3 possible interviews.
Okay.
Then we'll finish out, we'll fill that position.
Yeah, we'll get somebody good in there.
Yeah. All right. I think our time has come to a close. So Dr. Eerkens, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening.
I hope it was of interest and yeah. Cool.
All right. See you next time.
Thank you.